Today's video is brought to you by Keeps, the brilliant service that helps you keep your hair. Look, for me, I started noticing I was losing my hair in my early 20s or more. Other people started noticing eventually. You know, you're in a changing room at a store and they got those weird mirrors and you catch the back of your head and you're like, oh God, this is happening, no. But when this happened to me, Keeps didn't exist. It was just like, well, looks like we're gonna have to go all Bruce Willis and shave this off, except I'm not cool like Bruce Willis. But look, good news for you, young, hairy, still friend. If you do catch that weird look in the mirror and notice you're losing your hair, Keeps are there for you. They're an online subscription service with doctor-recommended hair loss treatments, clinically proven stuff. There's no snake oil BS here. That just ends in tears and baldness. Plus, it's all delivered right to your door, so it's super convenient. Also, super affordable, about half the price of the same thing in the pharmacy. Why would you even go to the pharmacy? It's more of a hassle and it's more expensive. Look, Keeps is easier, it's cheaper, it's a win-win. Also, this isn't some, boom, thank you for the business, we're done thing. Keeps comes with a year of unlimited messaging with your prescribing doctor so you can ask any questions you have. Hair loss stops with Keeps. To get 50% off your first order, go to keeps.com/biographics or click the link in the description below. That's keeps.com/biographics. And now today's video. In the last days of 1927, America was spellbound by the drama playing out in a Cincinnati courtroom. George Remus, the king of the bootleggers, was on trial for his life for the murder of his wife in broad daylight in front of witnesses. By all accounts, the law had Remus dead to rights. In many ways, the Remus murder trial was a culmination of everything that had happened in his life to that point. The George Remus story has it all. Money, crime, newspaper headlines, and lots of liquor. At times cartoonish, Remus was nevertheless deadly serious when it came to both building and keeping his immense fortune, a fortune that inevitably slipped through his fingers as the illegality of his actions caught up with him. The strangest thing about George Remus, though, is that despite being absurdly famous 100 years ago, you've probably never even heard of him. Not the real story, anyway. Good thing, though, because, well, we're about to sort that out. In 1902, George Remus had decided that being a pharmacist wasn't for him. The 26-year-old German immigrant had gone far in the drugstore business, going from working as a clerk in his uncle's store to owning two of them himself, as well as a wholesale drug distribution business. He was married with a young daughter and probably could have continued a prosperous and anonymous lifestyle in Chicago until the end of his days. But that wasn't what George wanted. He wanted the American dream, the brass ring, the kind of opulent lifestyle that the robber barons of the period were living. He wanted more. So, he went to law school, graduating and passing the bar in 1904. He set up his own practice, initially specializing in labor law, before becoming one of the most famous criminal defense attorneys in Chicago. He excelled in death penalty cases, high-profile murder trials where his client's life was on the line, just like his mentor, celebrity attorney Clarence Darrow. Remus would do whatever it took to win, including resorting to trickery. In one trial, he dramatically drank from a bottle of poison to prove it was safe, and therefore that his client had to be innocent. Of course, the jury had no idea that Remus had ingested the antidote before entering the courtroom. When his charisma and bluster didn't work, sometimes Remus would challenge the opposing counsel to a fistfight, a common theme ran throughout his life. Remus was a walking publicity machine. He craved the attention of newspaper reporters, not only because he thrived on being the center of attention, but because he knew that press notoriety was a great way to attract more clients. He worked long hours, but he was well compensated for his time, and he earned $45,000 in 1919, over 12 times the national average. Still, he dreamed of more. And he discovered an easy way to obtain the riches he desired when the 18th Amendment to the US Constitution went into effect in 1920. Prohibition was perhaps the strangest thing the United States ever did as a nation. The Volstead Act banned the manufacture, importation, or sale of alcoholic beverages throughout the country. The end result of a decades-long campaign by temperance associations like the Anti-Saloon League. Overnight, a billion-dollar industry was rendered illegal. Tens of thousands of jobs disappeared, and hundreds of breweries and distilleries were forced to shut down. According to the Anti-Saloon League, Prohibition was supposed to be the cure for most of American society's ills, but making alcohol illegal did not make the desire for alcohol disappear. Instead, those who wanted to drink would turn to the black market, which already existed for years because of bans in individual states that predated national prohibition. Those who smuggled or sold illegal alcohol were known as rum runners or bootleggers, and in 1920 they were making obscene amounts of money bringing in liquor from wherever they could get it. George Remus defended many bootleggers in federal court. He was amazed, just like everyone else, that no matter how steep the fine levied by the judge, the bootleggers just shrugged and paid and then went right back out and started breaking the law again. These guys had more money than they knew what to do with, and they were little better than common thugs. Remus figured that a man of vision, a smart businessman like himself, could go into this illegal business and make a massive fortune, one that would make his lawyer's salary looked like chump change. Abruptly, Remus sold off all of his business interests in Chicago, closed his law office, and left town. He left engrossed in scandal. The newspapers had covered all the salacious details of his extramarital affair with Imogene Holmes, leading to an ugly divorce from his wife Lillian. What few people knew at the time, however, was that he was also running from the law, escaping a prohibition charge for trying to sell whiskey out of a warehouse in the north side of the city. Remus would eventually bribe his way out of a prison cell in that case, but in the meantime, he needed to start over somewhere else. 300 miles to the south of Chicago is the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. Situated on the banks of the Ohio River that forms the border with Kentucky, Cincinnati was a manufacturing town, home to large companies like Procter & Gamble and Kroger. It also had a sizable German population. The city's over-the-Rhine neighborhood was hit hard by Prohibition closing the bars and the breweries. Most importantly for George Remus, however, Cincinnati gave access to the untapped riches of Kentucky's Bourbon Trail. When Prohibition took effect, the country's distilleries were forced to shut down, but their existing supplies of spirits weren't destroyed, but kept in warehouses, guarded by federal officials. 80% of the stored whiskey in America could be found within 300 miles of Cincinnati in the warehouses of Kentucky's shuttered Bourbon distilleries. If Remus could get to it, he would be a very rich man. For his plan to work, Remus relied on a rather glaring loophole in the Prohibition legislation. It was still legal to manufacture and sell alcohol if it was for medicinal purposes. In the days before medical science had caught up to where it is today, many ailments were treated with prescriptions of liquor or medicines that contained large amounts of alcohol. In order to possess medicinal alcohol, all you needed was a government certificate, which was easy to obtain if you bribed the person that was responsible for making them. The way it worked was relatively simple. Remus or one of his associates would buy a shuttered distillery, often for pennies on the dollar, as the despondent owners were happy to collect at least some money on what was now apparently useless property. Sometimes Remus would restart production under the guise of producing medical-grade bourbon, and sometimes he just bought the property to empty out the storehouse of existing inventory. Using his knowledge of the pharmacy industry, Remus would open up drugstores that served as a front for his bourbon shipments, most of which never made it to the stated destination. Instead, it was reported missing, lost, or stolen, when in reality, it was actually being taken to a secret distribution point just outside of Cincinnati. From there, it was sold to other bootleggers who transported it out of town to sell it to individual customers. Remus was successful for two reasons: quantity and quality. His network had access to millions of gallons of whiskey, far more than anyone else, allowing him to corner the market. And the bourbon was the good stuff, because unlike many other bootleggers, Remus refused to cut his product in order to make a bigger profit. If you were lucky, all they did was water it down. But if you were unlucky, the liquor you bought might be mixed with industrial alcohol or sterno, used as a heating fuel, or something else that would be more likely to poison you than get you drunk. Prohibition newspapers were filled with stories of people who died after drinking tainted alcohol. No such issue with Remus's product. In a matter of months, Remus was the head of a huge enterprise, employing hundreds of workers and serving as the primary supplier of alcohol to the country's two largest cities, New York and Chicago. He established relationships with local gangster kingpins, including Arnold Rothstein in New York and Johnny Torrio in Chicago. After Torrio was shot in 1925, he retired and handed the reins over to his lieutenant, Al Capone, the Jazz Age's most notorious criminal. Unlike Capone, who ruled through fear, Remus didn't need to resort to violence in the name of business. Remus believed that every man had his price, and he had so much money that he was perfectly willing to pay that price. He bribed everyone: local cops, prohibition agents, politicians, civil servants, night watchmen, farmers, anyone that he needed to. His web of graft extended all the way to Washington, with tens of thousands of dollars paid to Jess Smith, the assistant and bagman for Attorney General Harry Doughty. That didn't mean his enterprise was a peaceful one, however. Bootlegging was a dangerous business, after all. Each one of Remus's shipments was accompanied by a carload of well-armed gunmen to fend off would-be hijackers, and his own private army protected the primary distribution point, which quickly became known as Death Valley because of what would happen to anyone that showed up and attempted to steal Remus's liquor. George Remus had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, and he and his new wife, Imogene, were quick to take advantage of their newfound fortune. The couple lived in a huge mansion in Cincinnati's fashionable Price Hill neighborhood, and Remus did business in his own 6-story office building downtown, just like the captains of industry he modeled himself after. His home life was like a real-life version of The Great Gatsby, as George and Imogene filled their home with whatever opulent thing happened to catch their eye. Furniture, artwork, marble statues, sculptures, jewelry, tailored clothing, furs, carpets, so much stuff that it didn't all fit in and had to be stored in the attic. They owned a fleet of cars to take them wherever they wanted to go, and spent at least $150,000 on a luxurious indoor pool and bathhouse complex in the mansion. And still, he found himself with more money. He literally had more cash than things to spend it on. To go with his newfound riches, he formed an eccentric personality that made him stand out in both the criminal underworld and the privileged society to which he attempted to purchase membership. He always carried an ornate walking stick with a heavy head, good for both showcasing his sophistication and for clubbing people over the head when he lost his temper with them. Since his business ran primarily on cash transactions and Remus distrusted banks, he was known to carry large amounts of currency on his person at all times, to the point of it sometimes falling out of his coat pockets. One of his most unique traits was a tendency to refer to himself in the third person, a personality quirk known as Iliism. He liked to call himself Remus, especially when talking to newspaper reporters who he spent a lot of time with, despite the clandestine nature of his business. Not even Remus himself knew how much money he made or spent, since he didn't keep account books or write anything down that would be incriminating evidence if authorities ever got a hold of it. But it is believed that his bourbon empire sold whiskey worth hundreds of millions of dollars, several billion dollars in today's money, and Remus got the biggest piece of that pie since he ran the entire organization. Remus was certainly one of the richest criminals in America and one of the most successful bootleggers. Perhaps, in hindsight, he was a bit too successful. In Washington, D.C., the head of the Prohibition Bureau, Mabel Willebrandt, was fuming. It seemed like nobody was taking Prohibition seriously, least of all those charged with enforcing the law. The Bureau was understaffed, underfunded, overwhelmed, and riddled with corruption. The scale of the law-breaking had clearly taken everyone by surprise, and the government was slow to respond. As Deputy Attorney General, Willebrandt was the most powerful woman in America, and she still had greater ambitions, like becoming the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court. Prohibition enforcement had to be improved if her political goals were to be realized. What she needed was a high-profile success, something to splash around the nation's newspapers and give her the positive publicity that she needed to gain credibility. She had to take down a kingpin. In October 1921, Death Valley was raided by Prohibition agents. Despite Remus's instructions, his underlings left a lot of incriminating evidence lying around, which was seized. Remus was arrested and charged with violating the Volstead Act. Released on bond, the bootlegger went about his business with little concern for the upcoming trial. He figured that his bribery network was extensive enough that he would be protected from prison. He was so unworried that on New Year's Eve he hosted a lavish party for 300 guests in which diamonds, stickpins, and cars were given away as party favors. But Mabel Willebrandt had her sights set on Remus. She was determined to string him up as a poster child for her cause, to showcase to America that Prohibition was working. In May 1922, Remus was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. At another trial later that month, he was sentenced to an additional year in prison in Ohio. Remus remained free while he appealed his conviction, certain that his friends in high places would intercede on his behalf. What Remus didn't realize, however, was that the administration of President Warren G. Harding was about to completely fall apart. Harding himself is not known to have been corrupt, but the people around him, collectively known as the Ohio Gang, made graft an art form, enriching themselves by misusing the power of their officers, accepting bribes, and orchestrating insider deals at government expense. In 1923, a thread was pulled, and the scheme began to unravel. The Senate investigation into the Department of Justice was turning up unpleasant facts about the Attorney General and his aide, Jess Smith. Harding told Secretary Doughty to cut his friend Smith loose to save himself. Despondent, Smith committed suicide on May 30th, 1923. 2 months later, on August 2nd, President Harding himself died, plunging the nation into mourning. Harry Doughty was ousted as Attorney General by President Calvin Coolidge in 1924. At the same time, Remus had run out of appeals, as they had all been rejected. All of his bribes, all the assurances he had received from public officials, all of it had come to nothing. He was incarcerated at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in January 1924. While Remus was in prison, his wife Imogene was left in charge of all of his assets. This suited her just fine, as she loved the opulent lifestyle that she'd become accustomed to since 1920. She had dumped her first husband for Remus because she believed he could provide her with a better quality of life, and now here she was, in charge of billions of dollars of untraceable money and valuables. It was almost too good to resist, especially once she met and fell in love with a man named Franklin Dodge Jr. Dodge, ironically enough, was a Prohibition agent, and not just any Prohibition agent either. He had played an instrumental part in putting George Remus in prison. Now he was not only going to steal Remus's wife, but all of his money too. Imagine the bootlegger's surprise when he was released from prison in September 1925, only to be hit with divorce papers from his supposed loving wife. His shock got even worse when he arrived back in Cincinnati to discover his mansion stripped down to the floorboards as Imogene and Dodge had carried off all of his valuables. They'd spent the last 2 years systematically plundering what was left of his empire, living the high life while George rotted in prison. And the worst part was there was little George could do about it, especially when he ended up back in jail in Ohio from July 1926 to April 1927 for the second conviction, after those appeals were also exhausted. All the while, acrimonious divorce proceedings dragged their way through the court system as Imogene attempted to take George for all that he had, and George striking back, alleging Imogene had participated in illegal activities as part of his bootlegging business, as well as accusing her of adultery, which was still a prosecutable offense in those days, especially for a woman. Things got increasingly ugly. Rumors swirled that Dodge and Imogene were offering a $15,000 bounty to anyone that would kill Remus. George's friends reported that he was becoming increasingly unhinged, following Dodge and Imogene around and ranting about getting revenge. Despite his outward image as a gentleman, Remus was known for losing his temper and lashing out. Both of his wives had alleged he'd struck them on multiple occasions, and he had been arrested several times for assault. Things reached a breaking point on October 6, 1927. That morning, George watched from a car as his wife and stepdaughter, Ruth, climbed into a taxicab and headed downtown for a meeting with Imogene's attorney. As the cab drove off, Remus's car followed. Remus chased the cab down the street, running it off the road and into the grass of the lush Eden Park. Remus's car forced the cab to stop next to a lake and a gazebo, a popular picnic spot and play area for Cincinnati families. Imogene fled from the car, chased by George, who caught up to her and grabbed her. Remus cursed his wife, punched her in the face, before pulling a pearl-handled pistol from his coat pocket. In front of dozens of shocked onlookers, Remus fired a single shot into Imogene's abdomen and then fled the scene on foot. 2 hours later, Imogene Remus died on the operating table. At the same time, George Remus had turned himself in to Cincinnati police detectives and confessed to the shooting. The Bourbon King was now on the hook for murder. Remus was now in for the fight of his life, literally. Conviction almost certainly meant death in Ohio's electric chair. Accordingly, he pulled out all the stops to try and save himself. No one could deny that he had shot and killed his wife. The evidence was overwhelming. Remus's defense, therefore, borrowed from a tactic he'd used over a decade earlier when defending a man accused of wife-slaying in Chicago, a temporary insanity defense. His contention was that his wife's actions had driven him literally crazy to the point of shooting her, something he wouldn't have done if he'd been in his right mind, and therefore he shouldn't be held responsible for his actions that day. Remus acted as his own defense attorney throughout the trial, facing off against Hamilton County Chief Prosecutor Charles P. Taft II. Charles was the youngest son of William Howard Taft, the only man to have held both the office of the President and of United States Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The sensational trial played out in the courtroom and in the newspapers, Remus utilizing his connections with reporters to sway public opinion to his side. He put the victim on trial, smearing Imogene and Franklin Dodge as players in a nefarious plot to destroy him. He showed conclusive evidence that the two of them were having an affair and that they'd conspired to steal his money and property. He made other accusations as well. They were trying to get him locked up, deported back to Germany, or even trying to kill him. Taft countered by arguing that it didn't matter what Imogene did to George, that didn't give him the right to kill her. He brought a parade of alienists, the 1920s type of what we today call a psychiatrist, to testify that Remus had always been sane, including on the day of the murder. But he was always fighting an uphill battle. Prohibition was growing increasingly unpopular, and those who provided the masses with bootleg liquor were seen as a kind of folk hero. The court of public opinion was firmly on Remus's side from the start, which surely had an effect on the jury. On December 20th, 1927, they found Remus not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. They had deliberated for only 19 minutes. Remus spent 6 months at the state hospital for the criminally insane while lawyers battled in the courtroom about whether he was actually insane. He was released after the Ohio Supreme Court determined that he wasn't, and just like that, Remus was a free man. Well, he may have been free, but the Bourbon empire that he'd built was gone. He wasn't completely broke, but the millions he'd earned had disappeared, seized by government officials or squandered by his wife and her lover. And he had no taste to try and restart it either. The bootleg gangs had risen to power while he was in prison and had grown increasingly violent and were drawing more and more negative attention to themselves. He was also too well known, not only in the media, but also to Prohibition agents, to escape attention for long if he tried to do anything else illegal. Prohibition ended on December 5, 1933, with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, the only constitutional amendment to repeal an earlier one. Individual states continued to ban alcohol for decades after national prohibition ended. The last dry state, Mississippi, went wet in 1966. The organised crime rackets that had sprung up around bootlegging didn't disappear after Prohibition ended. They simply transitioned into other markets like prostitution and gambling, becoming what's today simply known as the mob. George Remus lived the rest of his life in relative obscurity, dying in 1952 at the age of 75. His story is largely unknown, eclipsed by the more well-known story of Al Capone and his battle with Eliot Ness and his Untouchables. In many ways, the George Remus story perfectly encapsulates the Roaring Twenties, a sudden rise to unparalleled prosperity, conspicuous consumption, brutal violence underneath a veneer of sophistication, and a sudden fall from grace, losing it all and having to start over again. George Remus was many things throughout his life: pharmacist, lawyer, convict, the man who got away with murder. But for one brief, shining moment, George Remus was the king of the bootleggers, the evil genius of Prohibition. Alas, Remus had to find out the hard way what all of us learn sooner or later. All good things must, eventually, come to an end.